Long before the Jedi Order existed, long before the Republic had even formed, an entire civilization of intelligent insects was already thriving on a world they called Oroboro. And what we are about to walk through is one of the oldest and strangest stories in the entire Star Wars galaxy. The species was called the Killiks, but they did not call themselves that. They called themselves the Kind, and they were ancient. We are talking tens of thousands of years before the Galactic Republic was founded. While most of the species we know about in Star Wars were still figuring out the basics of survival, the Killiks had already built a functioning civilization. They had spread across their homeworld. They had expanded into neighboring star systems. They were one of the oldest known sentient species in the entire galaxy, and almost nobody in the Star Wars universe has ever heard of them. Now the planet they came from, Oroboro, is a name that probably does not ring any bells. But the name the rest of the galaxy gave it later definitely will. Oroboro is Alderaan, the same Alderaan that Princess Leia called home, the same world that the Empire would one day destroy with the Death Star. Thousands and thousands of years before any of that happened, this planet belonged to the Killiks. It was their world first, and the things they built there would still be standing when human colonists arrived tens of thousands of years later. So, what exactly were the Killiks? They were insects, intelligent, sentient insects, but not the kind of bugs you are picturing right now. The Killiks were incredibly diverse in their genetics. Every Killik belonged to a group called a nest, and each nest had its own set of physical traits. Members of the same nest looked alike, but different nests could look completely different from each other. Some Killiks were small, roughly the size of children. Others were enormous, growing as large as starships. That range is hard to wrap your head around, but that was the reality of this species. Tiny insects and building-sized creatures, all sharing the same core genetic code, all part of the same civilization. And these nests were not random groupings. Each one had a specialty. Some nests were built for warfare. Others focused on construction. Some made music. Some were scouts. And some specialized in something called subterfuge, which basically means they were good at sneaking around and staying hidden. The Killiks had figured out that instead of every member of the species trying to do everything, they could divide up the work across specialized groups. It was efficient. It worked. And it let them build a society that was far more organized than anything else in the galaxy at that point in time. But the thing that truly set the Killiks apart from every other species was how they communicated. They did not talk. They did not write letters. They used pheromones, which are chemical signals that other Killiks could pick up on automatically. On top of that, they used electromagnetic transmissions and long-distance telepathy, and all of these signals worked together at the same time. Heat, electrical impulses, magnetic fields, and chemical signals all firing off simultaneously to create a communication network that connected every single member of a nest to every other member. This is what made the hive mind possible. And the hive mind is the single most important thing to understand about the Killiks. Because individual Killiks did not really have personal identities. A single Killik did not think of itself as a separate person with its own goals and its own desires. Every member of a nest existed to serve the nest. The nest was the real individual. Each Killik was just one set of eyes, one set of ears, one pair of hands working on behalf of the whole. If a single Killik needed to give up its life for the benefit of the group, it would do so without hesitation. There was no debate. There was no fear of loss. The collective was everything, and the individual was nothing. From Oroboro, the Killiks expanded outward. They spread across their planet and then pushed into the stars, reaching neighboring systems millennia before the Republic even existed as a concept. They built their signature structures on every world they settled. These were large mound-like buildings called hive spires, towering insect-made constructions that dotted the landscapes of Alderaan, Alsakan, and possibly Utapau. These were the marks of a civilization that had been around longer than almost anything else in the galaxy. Now here is where the Killiks become truly dangerous for every other species in the Star Wars universe. The Killiks had a biological ability called the joining process, and this was not something they chose to do. It just happened naturally whenever Killiks spent enough time around members of other sentient species. What happened was this. The Killik pheromones would slowly start to change the brain of the non-Killik individual. Specifically, they altered the structure of something called the corpus callosum, which is the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. Once those changes took hold, signal impulses could transfer directly between the Killik brain and the non-Killik brain. The result was a joiner, a person from another species who was now permanently absorbed into the Killik hive mind. Their thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Their sense of individual identity started to fade. They became part of the nest, just like every other Killik, and the Killiks had a substance that made this bond even stronger. It was called membrosia. This was a consumable that the Killiks produced within their nests, and it was extremely addictive. Once a joiner started consuming membrosia, the connection to the hive mind deepened even further. It kept the whole organism functioning as one unified entity. The combination of the joining process and membrosia meant that any species that spent too much time around the Killiks was at risk of losing its members permanently to the collective. So, that is the Killiks in their earliest days. An ancient insectoid species with a collective mind that could absorb other beings into itself. A civilization older than almost anything else in the galaxy. Builders, warriors, musicians, and spies, all connected through a web of chemical and telepathic signals that turned millions of individual bodies into one enormous thinking organism. And the oldest hive of them all was the Thurut. The Thurut were the first nest, the original Killiks, and their collective memory stretched back further than any other group in the galaxy. The Thurut would later claim that they remembered witnessing something extraordinary. They said they had seen a family of beings called the Celestials forming out of a geyser of light on a distant world. And this memory, according to the Thurut, was over 1,000,000 years old. Now, whether that number is exact or not, the point is that the Killik hive mind carried memories that went back to the very beginning of recorded existence. But here is the thing about the Killiks and their memories. To them, there was no difference between myth and memory. What the hive remembered and what actually happened were the same thing. There was no way to separate one from the other. The collective mind treated everything it held as truth, whether it was a first-hand observation from yesterday or a fragment passed down through 100,000 generations. That made the Killiks both the most valuable historians in the galaxy and the most unreliable ones at the same time. Everything they remembered could be real, or it could be a story that got folded into the collective so long ago that nobody could tell the difference anymore. But either way, the Thurut had something that no other species could offer, a memory that reached back to the age of the Celestials themselves. and that memory would become critical to the survival of the entire galaxy thousands of years later. For now, though, the Killiks were just getting started. They had built their civilization on Oroboro. They had spread to the stars, and they were about to attract the attention of the most powerful beings the galaxy had ever seen. Beings who would use the Killiks to build wonders that reshaped the galaxy itself, and then throw them away when the work was done. Around 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, millions of Killiks were floating in open space. They had thin suits on, bubble helmets over their heads, no jetpacks, no cranes, no construction vehicles of any kind, just insects suspended in the vacuum, moving enormous durasteel girders into position with nothing but the Force. They were building the most powerful piece of technology the galaxy would ever see, and they were doing it with their minds. That station was called Koloralok by the Killiks, the World Puller. Everyone else would come to know it as Centerpoint Station, and the story of how the Killiks ended up building it starts with the beings who owned them. Prior to roughly 35,000 BBY, the galaxy belonged to the Celestials. Some called them the Architects. They were not a species. They were not aliens who had figured out advanced technology. The Celestials were described as entities of the Force itself, beings so far beyond mortal understanding that no one could fully explain what they were. 3 of them took physical form and became known as the Ones. The Father embodied balance. The Son embodied the dark side. The Daughter embodied the light. And if you have seen our video on the Mortis gods, you already know these 3 well. The Celestials needed labor. They needed a workforce that could operate on a galactic scale and follow orders without question. The Killiks were a perfect fit. Their hive mind meant there was no debate, no resistance, no individual who might refuse a command. The Celestials conscripted them and seeded Killik hives up and down the Polemian trade route, one of the oldest hyperspace lanes in the galaxy. Other species served the Celestials too. The Gree worked for them. The Qua worked for them. But the Killiks were arguably the most important workforce in the entire celestial operation. The Son and the Daughter ran the construction side of things directly. The Killiks actually knew these 2 as the Architects, and that name fit perfectly. They directed multiple hives across multiple systems, providing them with knowledge and with something far more valuable, access to the Force itself. See, building Centerpoint Station was not something the Killiks could do on their own. The scale was too large. The engineering was too advanced. So the Son and the Daughter did something that had never been done before and would never be done again. They became joiners. They willingly entered the Killik hive mind, connecting themselves to the collective consciousness of the Thurot, the oldest nest in existence. And through that connection, every Killik in the hive gained the ability to channel the Force. That changed everything. Suddenly, these insects could extract ore from asteroids and smelt it using telekinesis. They could propel themselves through space without engines or thrusters of any kind. The Force was flowing through the entire collective, directed by 2 celestial architects, and it turned the Killiks into something the galaxy had never seen before. A workforce that could reshape the stars. Centerpoint Station was the result. It was a tractor beam on a galactic scale, a single construct capable of moving planets, moving stars, and dragging black holes through hyperspace. The Tharut hive built it under the direct orders of the son and the daughter, and the construction process looked like nothing else in galactic history. Millions of bodies in space, no tools, no machines, just the Force holding everything together while an army of insects assembled a wonder that would still be functioning over 100,000 years later. Other hives were working at the same time on connected projects. They built planetary repulsors on habitable worlds, devices that worked in tandem with Centerpoint to allow the Celestials to physically rearrange the layout of the galaxy. And the first major demonstration of that power was the assembly of the Corellian system. Using Centerpoint Station, the Killiks pulled 5 planets across the galaxy and placed them into a single star system in perfect orbit. The Tharut called this system the 5 Rocks. The rest of the galaxy would eventually know it as the home of Corellia, Han Solo's homeworld. Every single time Corellia comes up in a Star Wars story, that is a planet the Killiks put there. The Corellian system was just one project among many. The Killiks also assembled the Hapes cluster, which would later become the territory of the Hapes Consortium. They constructed something called the Still Curtain. They built the Chasm of Forever, and they assembled a second station called Sinkhole Station, a construct that would become essential to events still thousands of years in the future. These were not buildings. These were not cities. The Killiks were assembling star systems and cosmic formations. They were physically rearranging the galaxy on behalf of beings who treated them as disposable tools. And they did all of it because 2 members of the most powerful family in existence had temporarily shared their gifts with the hive. Temporarily. That word matters more than anything else in this part of the story. When the labor was done, the son and the daughter disconnected from the hive mind. They pulled out of the collective consciousness and they took the Force with them. Whatever method they had used to share their abilities, they reversed it completely. One moment the Killiks could move planets. The next moment they were ordinary insects standing in the shadow of the things they had built but could no longer understand. They remembered all of it. The hive mind held on to every detail. What it felt like to channel the Force. What it felt like to float through space with no propulsion. What it felt like to be connected to 2 of the most powerful beings the galaxy had ever produced. Those memories stayed in the collective forever, but the ability to do any of it was gone. The Killiks had been handed the most extraordinary power in the galaxy. They had used it to build wonders that would outlast entire civilizations, and then that power was taken back without a second thought. The Ones had a family member that most people never talk about. She was not a Celestial. She was not on the same level as the father or the son or the daughter. But she had lived alongside them on a lush jungle planet for a very long time, and for a while things were peaceful. Her name was Abeloth, and the reason the Killiks got dragged back into service after Centerpoint Station was finished is because of what Abeloth became. So the son and the daughter came back to the Killiks. For the second time in the history of the galaxy, the 2 celestial siblings entered the Killik hive mind. They reconnected with the collective consciousness and they shared their Force abilities with the hives all over again. The same power that had allowed the Killiks to build Centerpoint Station flowed through them once more. And this time, the job was not construction. It was containment. The Killiks fired up Centerpoint Station, the world puller, the tractor beam that could move stars, and they used it to drag dozens of black holes across the galaxy. Not randomly, not carelessly. They arranged these black holes into a precise spherical formation around Abeloth's jungle planet, creating a shell of gravitational forces so intense that nothing could get through. The ionizing gases being pulled into the formation made the whole thing glow like a nebula from the outside. But getting past that glow was a different story. Any ship that tried to navigate through the black holes would be torn apart long before it reached the planet at the center. The galaxy would come to know this formation as the Maw Cluster, located near Kessel. And it was not just a cluster of black holes. It was a cage, built by insects, powered by gods, designed to hold one being in place for the rest of eternity. But a cage needs a god. So the Killiks built Sinkhole Station inside the Maw itself. This was the second station, smaller than Centerpoint, but just as critical. Its purpose was to monitor the prison from within, watching Abeloth and keeping the black hole formation stable over time. Black holes are not static. They drift. They pull on each other. Without something maintaining the precise arrangement, gaps would eventually form in the shell. Sinkhole Station existed to prevent that from happening. Working together, Centerpoint on the outside and Sinkhole on the inside created a containment system that made escape nearly impossible. The Tharut Hive, the oldest Killik nest, was directly responsible for this imprisonment. Killik slave laborers built Sinkhole Station with their own bodies and their borrowed force abilities. And the evidence of their labor lasted for a very long time. Over 100,000 years later, Luke Skywalker would explore Sinkhole Station and find the remains of a Killik slave still inside. A worker who had given everything to build a prison and was never recovered when the job was done. Abeloth sat inside that prison for 100,000 years, alone on the planet that had once been her home. The same world where she had lived with the father and his children, surrounded by jungle and mountains and the two force sources that had destroyed her. She was angry, she was terrified, and she was completely cut off from everything and everyone she had ever known. But the prison was not perfect. According to the Tharut, Abeloth found ways to escape. Whenever a major galactic event shifted the current of the Force, whenever something large enough happened to alter the fundamental flow of time and energy in the galaxy, the containment weakened, and Abeloth pushed through. Every single time she got out, the same thing happened. The son and the daughter would return to the Killiks, rejoin the hive mind, combine their strength with the collective, and fight Abeloth together. They would take her down, drag her back to the Maw, and seal the prison again. Then the galaxy would recover. And then, years or centuries or millennia later, the current would shift again, and the whole cycle would start over. This pattern repeated for thousands upon thousands of years. Something went wrong. After everything the Killiks had done for the Celestials, after building Centerpoint Station and Sinkhole Station, after assembling star systems and imprisoning the most dangerous being in existence, the relationship between the Killiks and their masters fell apart. The Killiks themselves claimed that the Celestials grew angry with the kind over something they had done. But the hive mind never recorded what that something actually was. The specifics were lost. All that remained was the memory that the Celestials turned on them. Luke Skywalker, thousands of years later, proposed a theory. He believed the Killiks had consumed every resource on their homeworld Oroboro and then tried to expand outward, laying claim to planets that did not belong to them. And if you think about what the Killiks are, That tracks perfectly. They are a hive species. They grow, they spread, they consume. That is their nature. A single nest can multiply until it covers an entire world, and then it needs somewhere else to go. Luke believed the Killiks had eaten Alderaan dry and started reaching for more, and the Celestials decided that was a line they could not allow the kind to cross. The punishment was total. The Celestials emptied Oroboro. They did not negotiate. They did not relocate the Killiks to a handful of approved worlds. They drove the entire Killik population off the planet and forced them into the unknown regions, the unmapped and dangerous stretch of the galaxy where almost no one willingly went. This happened roughly 10,000 Killik generations ago, which translates to about 20,000 years before the events we will get to later in this story. An entire species removed from the only home they had ever known and pushed into the darkness at the edge of the galaxy. And just like that, the Killiks vanished. The known galaxy forgot about them almost overnight. They left behind their hive spires on Alderaan and similar structures on Alsakan. But those were empty shells, hollow monuments to a civilization that was no longer there. The galaxy moved on. New species rose, new governments formed, and the Killiks became a footnote, if anyone remembered them at all. Now, what makes this period even more complicated is that the Celestials themselves were falling apart at the same time. Around 35,000 to 30,000 BBY, the power of the Celestials was fading, and into that vacuum stepped the Rakata. The Rakata were an aggressive, force-wielding species who had served as celestial subjects, and they were done taking orders. They revolted against their masters and launched a campaign of destruction that tore through every civilization connected to the old celestial order. Ancient Greek texts describe the Rakata's weapons with names that tell you everything you need to know about how terrifying they were. The gray swallowing, the faceless mouths. These were not subtle tools. The Rakata waged open war against every client species the Celestials had ever used. They drove the Gree all the way back to their home cluster. They nearly wiped the Qua off the map entirely. And the Killiks, who were already scattered and weakened from their exile, simply disappeared from the historical record during this period. There was armed conflict between the Killiks and the Rakata. That much is confirmed. The Rakata were determined to remove or destroy every rival among the former celestial slave species, and the Killiks were a target. But the Rakata were not the primary reason the Killiks ended up in the unknown regions. That responsibility belonged to the Celestials. The Rakata may have made things worse. They may have pushed the Killiks further into hiding. But the exile itself was the Celestials' doing. The beings the Killiks had served faithfully for tens of thousands of years were the ones who threw them out. Not every Killik left Alderaan, though. A small number stayed behind. They burrowed deep underground beneath a region called the Castle Lands and went into hibernation. These survivors became known to later inhabitants as the Black Hive, and every few hundred years they would wake up. They would come to the surface, run into whatever species happened to be living on Alderaan at the time, cause problems, and then retreat back underground to sleep again. A cycle that repeated over and over for millennia, like a ghost that refuses to leave the house it once owned. When human colonists arrived on Alderaan around 27,500 BBY, the Killiks were already ancient history. All the humans found were the empty hive spires standing across the landscape. Towering structures built by a species that had been gone for thousands of years. The Alderaanians had no idea who had built them or where the builders had gone. Over time, the Killiks became monsters in Alderaanian legend. Scary stories about giant insects that used to live on their world. And when the Black Hive would periodically surface and confirm that those stories were actually true, the Alderaanians responded by establishing something called the Order of Extermination, a permanent institution designed to deal with the Killiks whenever they emerged from the ground. That is what the Killiks had been reduced to. A species that once moved planets and assembled star systems was now treated as a pest problem by colonists who had no idea what these insects had accomplished. Meanwhile, deep in the unknown regions, the exiled Killiks were barely surviving. They had no central leadership. They had no connection to the wider galaxy. Individual nests operated on their own, scattered and disorganized, subsisting on whatever they could find in the uncharted parts of the galaxy. The hive mind still carried a primal memory of the Exodus, a sense that they had once been somewhere else, that they had once been something more. But the details were gone. The surviving hives could not even remember why they had left. The reason for their exile had faded from the collective memory, leaving behind only the feeling of loss without the story to explain it. They existed like that for millennia, thousands and thousands of years in the darkness, going nowhere, doing nothing of significance, carrying the ghost of a history they could no longer fully access. And there is one more detail from this era that deserves attention. According to a Shistavanen legend, at least one Killik during this period became a Sith Lord. This individual reportedly lived in exile on a planet called Sarafur after being driven off of Alsakan. A Killik Sith Lord, an insect that had been touched by the dark side of the Force during one of the most obscure eras in galactic history. It is a small detail, buried in the legends of another species entirely, but it proves something important. Even scattered, even beaten down, even exiled to the edges of the galaxy, with their memories fading and their power gone, the Killiks were still capable of producing individuals who could connect to the Force in ways that shaped the world around them. 20,000 years. That is how long the Killiks spent in the unknown regions, doing absolutely nothing of significance. Scattered across uncharted worlds with no central leadership, no connection to the wider galaxy, and no purpose beyond basic survival. Individual nests operated on their own. They did not coordinate. They did not communicate across systems. They just existed. The species that had once assembled star systems and imprisoned a being made of the Force was now a collection of isolated insect colonies, barely holding on in the darkest corner of the galaxy. And then a ship crashed on one of their worlds and everything changed. The year was 27 ABY. The galaxy was in the middle of the Yuuzhan Vong War, one of the most devastating conflicts in Star Wars history. An extragalactic species called the Yuuzhan Vong had invaded and was tearing through the galaxy with biological weapons and living technology that the New Republic could barely fight against. In the middle of that war, the Jedi sent a strike team on one of the most dangerous missions of the entire conflict. A group of young Jedi Knights was sent to the Yuuzhan Vong world ship Banu Ras, which was orbiting the planet Mirka. Their target was the Voxine, deadly creatures that had been specifically engineered to hunt Force-sensitive beings. The Voxine were wiping out Jedi across the galaxy, and the strike team was supposed to destroy the queen that was producing them. The mission went badly. Anakin Solo, the youngest son of Han and Leia, was lost during the fighting. Jacen Solo was captured by the Yuuzhan Vong. Several other Jedi on the team were gone. It was one of the worst single losses the Jedi Order had suffered during the entire war. And in the chaos of that disaster, two people saw an opportunity. Their names were Lomi Plo and Welk. Lomi Plo was a dark Jedi, a former member of the Shadow Academy, and secretly a part of Darth Krayt's hidden Sith order called the One Sith. Welk was her apprentice. While the Jedi strike team was falling apart on Banu Ras, Lomi and Welk stole a freighter called the Tachyon Flyer, and they did not leave alone. They grabbed a young Jedi Padawan named Raynar Thul and took him with them. The Tachyon Flyer jumped to the unknown regions. Whether Lomi Plo had a destination in mind or whether the ship was running on desperation is unclear. What is clear is that the freighter came down hard on a planet called Yogoi, a Killik nest world. The landing was a wreck. All three occupants were severely burned and critically injured. The ship was destroyed. They were stranded on an alien world at the edge of the galaxy with no way to call for help and no reason to believe anyone would come looking. What Raynar Thul did next says everything about who he was. Despite his own horrible injuries, despite the burns covering his body, he dragged Lomi Plo and Welk out of the wreckage. He saved both of their lives. This was a Jedi Padawan pulling two dark Jedi from a burning ship because he believed that every life mattered, even the lives of people who had just kidnapped him. He could have left them. Nobody would have blamed him. But Raynar Thul was not that kind of person. The Yogoi Killiks found them at the crash site, and the Hive's first reaction tells you everything about what the Killiks had become after 20,000 years of isolation. Their instinct was to wait for Raynar to finish dining and so they could feed his body to their larvae. That was the calculation. One injured alien was worth more as food than as anything else. Individual life meant nothing. The nest was all that mattered. But then the joining process started, and this is where the story takes a turn that nobody could have predicted. Because Raynar Thul was not an ordinary person being absorbed into an ordinary hive. He was Force-sensitive, and his connection to the Force made the joining process do something it had never done before. As Raynar's personality merged with the Yogoi collective, his values started flowing into the hive. His respect for individual life, his belief that every single being matters, his compassion. These were concepts the Killiks had never operated with. For tens of thousands of years, a single Killik was nothing more than a tool for the nest. Expendable, replaceable, meaningless on its own. But Raynar's mind was now part of the collective, and his way of thinking began reshaping the entire nest from the inside out. The Yogoi started caring for their injured. They started treating individuals as something worth preserving. They learned the value of a single life, a concept that was completely alien to them before Raynar arrived. And instead of weakening the hive, this new perspective made them stronger. A nest that cared about its members was more resilient than one that treated them as disposable parts. Out of this transformation came something entirely new. A nest called Unu. And at the center of it stood a figure who was no longer fully Raynar Thul and no longer fully Killik. He was both. He took the name Unu Thul, the Prime Unu, the spokesman and leader of what would become the colony, a unified collective that the Killiks called the Nest of Nests. For the first time in millennia, the Killiks had a central voice. One mind that could speak for all of them. One leader who could direct the hives toward a common goal. Under Unu Thul's leadership, the colony grew fast. By 35 ABY, just 8 years after the crash on Yogoi, there were at least 375 nests operating under the colony's banner. The Killiks went from a scattered collection of isolated hives with no direction to a functioning civilization with centralized leadership and a shared purpose. It was the most dramatic transformation the species had undergone since the Celestials had plugged into their hive mind over 100,000 years earlier. And this time, the change had come from a single burned Jedi Padawan lying in the wreckage of a stolen ship. But Raynar was not the only one who had been absorbed by the Killiks on Yogoi. Lomi, Plo, and Welk had survived the crash too. They had gone through the joining process right alongside Raynar. And while Raynar's values were reshaping the colony into something better, Lomi Plo's nature was creating something else entirely. Something that operated in the shadows. Something that fed on secrecy and fear and the dark side of the Force. The colony had a new leader, but it also had a new darkness growing underneath it that nobody, not even Unu Thul himself, knew was there. Think about how your own mind works for a second. You have the thoughts you are aware of, the decisions you make on purpose, the things you say and do because you chose to say and do them. But underneath all of that, there is a whole other layer of your mind that you cannot see. Your unconscious. It runs in the background. It shapes your behavior in ways you do not notice. It influences your choices without you ever realizing it is there. Now take that concept and apply it to a hive mind made up of hundreds of Killik nests spread across dozens of worlds. A collective consciousness with millions and millions of members, all connected through pheromones and telepathy. And somewhere buried inside that collective, hidden so deep that no one in the hive even knows it exists, there is a darkness running everything from underneath. That was the Gorog, the Dark Nest. When Lomi Plo went through the joining process on Yogoi alongside Raynar Thul, her personality shaped a new nest the same way Raynar's had shaped the Unu. But where Raynar brought compassion and respect for individual life, Lomi Plo brought something very different. She was a Night Sister from Dathomir. She was a secret agent of Darth Krayt's one Sith, and the single trait that defined her more than anything else was her desire to hide. Secrecy was not just a skill for Lomi Plo. It was her entire identity. She lived in the shadows. She operated through deception. And when that personality was absorbed into the Killik hive mind, it did not just create a new nest. It created a nest that was invisible. The Gorog were unlike any Killik hive that had ever existed. Other nests specialized in construction or warfare or scouting. The Gorog specialized in not being found. They were secretive, manipulative, and violent. They could infiltrate other Killik nests without being detected. They moved through the colony like parasites inside a body, hidden cells embedded among other hives, doing their work without triggering any alarm. No other nest knew the Gorog were there. Not a single one. Lomi Plo sat at the center of all of it. She became the Unseen Queen. That title was not a boast. It was a literal description of what she was. Lomi could not be seen. Her connection to the dark side of the Force was so strong that she could mask herself and her entire nest from detection. She could hide from Unuthul, the leader of the colony, and a powerful Force-sensitive joiner. She could hide from Luke Skywalker, the Jedi Grand Master, arguably the most powerful Force user alive at the time. If Lomi Plo sensed even a flicker of doubt in someone's mind, she could latch on to that doubt and use it as cover. She would hide behind it in the Force, and the person looking for her would stop seeing her. She would become invisible, not metaphorically, functionally invisible to anyone using the Force to search for her. Her apprentice Welk took the title of Night Herald, the protector of the Queen. Together, the two of them used their knowledge of the dark side to give the Gorog abilities that no Killik nest had ever had before. The dark side was flowing through the hive, and it made the Gorog dangerous in ways that went far beyond normal Killik capabilities. The Gorog soldiers themselves were terrifying on a physical level. They were bluish in color, distinct from other Killik types, but easy to miss if you were not looking for them. They fought by getting close to their targets, piercing the skin, and spitting a highly acidic brownish poison directly into the wound. And if a Gorog soldier's outer shell was cracked open during a fight, the individual would explode. Their bodies were essentially living bombs. Breach the carapace and the Gorog detonates, taking out everything nearby. Fighting them meant that every single one you engaged could take you with it. On top of all that, the Gorog produced their own version of Membrosia. The Gorog version was called Black Membrosia, and it was worse in every way. More addictive, more dangerous. A tool designed to pull people deeper into the dark nest's influence and keep them there permanently. And then there was Lomi Plo herself. The years she had spent fused with the Killik hive mind had changed her body in ways that were hard to even look at. She had grown a pair of Killik arms above her original human ones. Her eyes had been replaced with compound Killik eyes. Her lower jaw had become a Killik mandible. One of her legs was gone, replaced by a Killik leg. Her entire body was encased in a cylindrical Killik pressure carapace. She was not human anymore. She was not Killik either. She was a fusion of both. A Night Sister's mind wrapped in an insectoid body, connected to the dark side of the Force, and commanding a hidden army that nobody could see. The most unsettling part of the whole situation was that Unuthul had no idea any of this was happening. He was the leader of the colony. He was connected to every nest through the hive mind. He should have been able to feel the Gorog the same way he could feel every other hive under his authority, but he could not. When anyone brought up the possibility that a hidden nest was operating inside the colony, Unuthul denied it completely. And he was not lying. He was not covering for the dark nest. He genuinely could not perceive them. The Gorog existed beneath the level of awareness that Unuthul had access to, the same way your unconscious mind operates beneath your awareness. It was there. It was influencing everything, and the conscious mind had absolutely no idea. That gave the Gorog the freedom to do whatever they wanted without oversight, and what they wanted was war. Over the years following the crash on Yogoi, the Dark Nest began working quietly to push the colony toward conflict. The Gorog's ultimate goal was to start a fight large enough that the Killiks would be forced to expand across the galaxy, not just into a few neighboring systems, across the entire galaxy. absorbing every sentient species they encountered into the hive mind through the joining process. Every human, every Wookiee, every Twi'lek, every thinking being in the Star Wars galaxy would become part of the colony. And since the Gorog controlled the hidden layer of the colony's consciousness, that meant Lomi Plo would control everything. Every mind in the galaxy connected through a hive mind that she was secretly running from the shadows. That was the endgame. Total absorption, total control. A galaxy where every sentient being was a joiner, and every joiner was unknowingly serving the unseen queen. The Killiks had spent 20,000 years as a scattered and forgotten species in the unknown regions. Now they had a leader in Unuthul who was building them into a real civilization again. And underneath that leader, invisible to everyone, the dark nest was steering the whole thing toward a conflict that would swallow the galaxy whole. The Chiss knew about the Killiks before the Jedi did. That is the part of this story that most people miss. By 35 ABY, the colony had expanded so far from its roots in the unknown regions that its border was pressing right up against Chiss ascendancy space. And the Chiss were not just aware of the Killiks. They had a history with them. Several Chiss ruling families had actually hired entire Killik nests for industrial labor. They brought the insects in as workers, the same way the Celestials had used them 100,000 years earlier, and the Chiss thought they could handle it. They put strict precautions in place to prevent the joining process from taking hold. They were careful, they were disciplined, they were the Chiss. It did not matter. 2 entire ruling families became joiners anyway. Their minds were absorbed into the Killik hive. 3 more families became so dependent on insect labor that they could not function without it. The internal damage to the ascendancy was severe. The most organized and controlled society in the unknown regions had tried to use the Killiks as tools, and the Killiks had absorbed them from the inside. The border dispute between the colony and the Chiss was not just a territorial argument. It was personal. The Chiss had already lost people to the hive mind, and they were not going to lose more. That was the situation when Unuthul reached out through the Force. He sent a call, and it was not aimed at just anyone. He targeted the survivors of the Merca mission specifically, the same mission where Raynar Thul had been taken, the same mission where Anakin Solo had been lost and Jacen Solo had been captured. The young Jedi who had been on that strike team 8 years earlier felt the call in the Force, and they responded. Jaina Solo, Jacen Solo, Zek, Lo Baka, Tahiri Vela, Tessar Sebatin. One by one, they traveled to the unknown regions to find the source of what was pulling at them. Luke Skywalker, Mara Jade, Han Solo, and Leia Organa Solo followed not long after. They went to find out what had happened to the young Jedi who had suddenly disappeared into uncharted space. And what they found when they arrived was the last thing any of them expected. The Killiks, a species that the galaxy had assumed was extinct, were very much alive. Hundreds of nests, an organized civilization, a functioning collective stretching across multiple worlds. And standing at the center of it was a figure covered in horrible burn scars, barely recognizable but still identifiable. Raynar Thul, the Jedi Padawan who had been taken during the chaos on Banu Ras 8 years earlier, was now the leader of an entire species. He called himself Unuthul, the Prime Unu, leader of the colony. And he had a problem he wanted the Jedi to help with. The Chiss were pushing back against Killik expansion, and Unuthul wanted Jedi support in the border dispute. He framed it as a simple territorial disagreement. But when Luke and the others started asking questions, things got complicated fast. Unuthul had no memory of Lomi Plo or Welk. He could not explain gaps in his own recollection of the crash on Yogoi. He talked about the colony as though it were a force for good in the galaxy, and in many ways it was. But the holes in his story were obvious to anyone paying attention. The Jedi started spending time among the Killiks, and the hive mind started working on them. Jaina Solo and Zek were the most affected. The two of them became deeply joined, their minds merging together through the Killik pheromonal connection until they were finishing each other's sentences. They were becoming one mind in two bodies. Jaina Solo, one of the strongest-willed Jedi of her generation, was having her individuality swallowed by the collective. She was disappearing into the hive, and the process was happening so gradually that she barely noticed it. The Twi'lek Jedi Alema Ra was joined as well, but her connection did not pull her toward the main colony. Alema became linked to the Gorog. The Dark Nest had found its way into a Jedi Knight, and that connection would have consequences that stretched far beyond this conflict. The truth about the crash started to surface through Jacen Solo. Jacen had an ability called flow walking, which allowed him to view the past through the Force. He used it to look back at the events on Yogoi 8 years earlier, and what he saw confirmed what Luke had suspected. Raynar Thul had saved Lomi Plo and Welk from the burning wreckage of the Tachyon flyer. The Dark Jedi had survived the crash. They had been absorbed by the Killiks, just like Raynar. And whatever they had become inside the hive mind was still out there. Then came the proof. A Jedi healer named Kilghal made a discovery that changed everything. The bluish Killiks that had been attacking the Skywalker and Solo families were not ordinary members of the colony. They were Gorog, the hidden nest, the unconscious mind of the hive. Kilghal confirmed that the Dark Nest was real, that it was operating inside the colony without Unuthul's knowledge, and that it was actively hostile. The thing that everyone had been told did not exist was right there in front of them, and it had been there the whole time. While all of this was unfolding, Jacen Solo was making moves of his own. He traveled to the Hapes Consortium and used his persuasion on Queen Mother Tenel Kajo, convincing her to send Hapan military forces to support the Killiks against the Chiss. This was a massive escalation. The Hapes Consortium was one of the wealthiest and most powerful political entities in the galaxy, and Jacen had just pulled them into a conflict in the unknown regions on behalf of a species most of the galaxy did not even know existed. During this visit, Jacen spent the night with Tenel Ka. That night would result in the birth of their daughter, Alana, a child whose existence would later become one of the driving forces behind the most devastating war the galaxy had seen since the fall of the Empire. The situation spiraled. The border tensions between the colony and the Chiss erupted into open fighting at Koribu, a system that sat right at the intersection of Killik and Chiss territory. The Battle of Koribu and the Battle of Kar followed in rapid succession. Luke and Mara tracked the Dark Nest to the moon of Kar in the Koribu system. They found the Gorog there, operating out of a hidden base, and the fight that followed was intense. Luke faced Welk, the Night Herald, Lomi Plo's apprentice and protector. Luke took him down, ending the Night Herald for good. During the same confrontation, Luke caught up with Alema Ra and severed her arm. He had the opportunity to finish her off completely. He chose not to. That decision would haunt the Jedi for years to come. With Welk gone and the Gorog scattered, a truce was brokered. Leia mediated the agreement, and the terms seemed reasonable on the surface. The Killiks would withdraw from Chiss space entirely and relocate to 14 habitable worlds in the Utagetu Nebula, far enough away from the Ascendancy that the border conflict would end. The Jedi walked away from the negotiating table, believing that the Dark Nest had been dealt with. Welk was gone. The Gorog had been exposed and driven out. The colony was moving to new territory. The Jedi were wrong. The unseen queen was still alive, and the 14 worlds the Killiks were about to settle on were carrying a secret of their own. One year. That is all it took for everything to fall apart again. The Korribu truce was supposed to end the Killik crisis. The colony relocated to 14 habitable worlds in the Utagetu Nebula. Welk was gone. The Gorog had been scattered. The Jedi went home believing the situation was under control. Lomi Plo was still alive, and she had spent the entire year making sure the next round of this fight would be worse than the first. Her first move was replacing what she had lost. Welk, her apprentice and Knight Herald, had fallen to Luke Skywalker on Kar. Lomi needed a new protector. She found one in Alema Ra, the Twi'lek Jedi who had been joined to the Gorog during the previous conflict. Lomi molded Alema into the new Knight Herald, shaping a fallen Jedi into the guardian of the Dark Nest. Alema had already been slipping toward darkness through her connection to the Gorog. Now, she belonged to them completely. Jaina Solo and Zek, still linked together by their Killik joining from the year before, were the first to notice something was off. The two of them were operating as a team, tracking down smugglers in the outer systems, and what they found pointed straight back to the Gorog. The Dark Nest was not just surviving. It was running smuggling operations. It was active, organized, and growing. But the smuggling was only one piece of what Lomi Plo had been doing. The bigger problem was the worlds themselves. The 14 planets in the Utagetu Nebula that the Killiks had been given as part of the Korribu truce turned out to be hiding something dangerous. The worlds were protected by a nanotechnology defense system called the Fizz. This was a corrosive environmental safeguard, far more advanced than anything the Galactic Alliance or the Chisses or the Killiks had ever encountered. The Fizz activated whenever something damaged the natural ecosystem of the planet, and when it activated, it dissolved whatever was causing the damage. That included Killik structures. That included living Killiks. The colony was settling on worlds that were actively destroying them. Every hive spire they built, every tunnel they dug, every resource they consumed triggered the Fizz, and the Fizz ate through everything it touched. The Killiks were trapped on planets that were fighting back against their very presence. Lomi Plo saw this disaster and turned it into a weapon. The Dark Nest spread a lie through the colony. They told the other nests that the Jedi had known about the Fizz all along, that the Jedi had deliberately chosen these worlds as a punishment for the Killiks, that the relocation was not a peace deal. It was a death sentence handed down by the people who were supposed to be helping them. None of it was true. The Jedi had no idea the Fizz existed when they brokered the truce. But truth did not matter. The lie worked. The colony turned against the Jedi, and Lomi Plo had exactly the anger she needed to push the Killiks toward the war she had always wanted. While the colony simmered, Lomi was working on the galactic stage. She sent pirates to raid Galactic Alliance shipping lanes between Risi and Adumar. disrupting trade and stretching Alliance military resources thin. She flooded the homeworlds of insectoid species across the galaxy with black membrosia, the corrupted and intensely addictive version of the substance the Killiks used to bond their hives. Entire populations of insect species were pulled into addiction and chaos. Lomi was not just destabilizing the Killiks' neighbors. She was destabilizing the galactic government itself. And then it got worse. Supreme Commander Cien Sov of the Galactic Alliance, the highest-ranking military officer in the galactic government, was caught in an accident caused by insect pilots who were under the influence of membrosia. Sov did not survive. The top military leader in the galaxy was gone, and the power vacuum his absence created threw Alliance military leadership into disarray. Lomi Plo had reached into the heart of the galactic government and removed one of the most important people in it, and she had done it without anyone connecting the incident back to the Dark Nest. The Galactic Alliance responded with force. The Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nek Boatu, was sent to blockade the Utagetu Nebula at a navigational choke point called the Murgo Choke. The idea was simple. If the Killiks could not leave the nebula, they could not expand. The Alliance would seal them in and deal with the problem from a position of strength. Inside the nebula, Lomi Plo was already 3 steps ahead. She had convinced Unuthul that the colony's only option was to break out. She told him that absorbing Chiss into the hive mind would not create more dark nests, another lie fed to a leader who could not detect the person lying to him. And under that false assurance, the colony started building. 15 massive nest ships took shape near a star called Tuscan's Eye. These were not small transports. These were vessels large enough to carry virtually all of the colony's nests. The entire Killik civilization packed into ships, ready to punch through the blockade and scatter into the wider galaxy. The breakout came at the Murgo Choke. The nest ships moved on the Alliance blockade, and several of them made it through into open space. But the Dark Nest's own ship did not escape cleanly. Mara Jade deployed a Jedi shadow bomb that damaged the Gorog vessel badly enough to prevent it from fleeing with the others. The Dark Nest was wounded, but not stopped. In the chaos of the breakout, something personal surfaced. Unuthul revealed to Mara Jade why the Dark Nest had been targeting her specifically throughout this entire conflict. The Gorog had absorbed the consciousness of 2 people from Mara's past, the wife and daughter of a man named Daxar Iis. Mara had ended Daxar Iis during her years serving as the Emperor's hand, long before she ever became a Jedi. His family's consciousness had been pulled into the Gorog hive, and now the Dark Nest wanted to settle that debt. The Unseen Queen was using personal grief as a weapon, reaching decades into the past to find pain she could aim at her enemies. Then Lomi Plo made her boldest move yet. She seized a Victory-class star destroyer called the Admiral Akbar, taking control of a warship and turning it against the people it was built to protect. And she confronted Luke Skywalker directly. The Jedi Grand Master and the Unseen Queen, face to face for the first time in a real fight. Luke nearly did not survive it. Lomi was terrifyingly powerful, but the fight taught Luke something critical about how she worked. Lomi Plo's invisibility in the Force was not some passive ability that ran on its own. It was powered by doubt. The moment Luke questioned whether she was really there, the moment any flicker of uncertainty crossed his mind, she vanished. She hid behind that doubt and became untouchable. But if Luke held absolute certainty in his mind, If he believed completely and without hesitation that she was standing right in front of him, she could not disappear. Her greatest weapon had a weakness, and that weakness was conviction. The Jedi now understood what they were dealing with. The unseen queen was real. She was more powerful than any of them had assumed. She was manipulating the colony, destabilizing the galactic government, and turning personal trauma into targeted attacks against her enemies. And the only way this was going to end was with someone walking into a room with zero doubt in their mind and finishing the job. Jaina Solo was leading Killik ground forces against the Chiss. Let that sit for a moment. One of the most talented Jedi Knights of her generation, the daughter of Han Solo and Leia Organa, was commanding swarms of Juge and Wrecker warrior Killiks on the battlefield. Zek was right there with her, running airborne squadrons in coordinated strikes. This was the Swarm War. It erupted in 36 ABY, a brief but devastating conflict that tore across the unknown regions and wild space. On one side stood the colony, hundreds of Killik nests unified under Unuthul and secretly manipulated by the Dark Nest. On the other side stood the Chiss Ascendancy, backed by the Galactic Alliance and the Jedi Order. And the spark that set the whole thing off came from the last person anyone expected. Jacen Solo attacked a Chiss military supply depot. His reasoning was that a preemptive Chiss strike against the Killiks would force the colony into a defensive posture, and that somehow this would lead to a resolution. It was a terrible miscalculation. Instead of provoking a controlled response, Jacen's attack lit the fuse on a war. The Killiks responded by launching their own assault on the Alliance forces that were still blockading the Utagetu Nebula. Within days, the conflict had spread across multiple systems, and there was no pulling it back. The Galactic Alliance scrambled to organize. Supreme Commander Gilad Pellaeon stepped into the leadership role left empty after Cien Sov's loss the year before. Pellaeon was one of the most experienced military commanders in galactic history, a veteran of the Imperial Navy who had survived the fall of the Empire and now served the Alliance. If anyone could hold a coalition together in the middle of a war nobody had planned for, it was him. On the Jedi side, Luke Skywalker did something that had not been done in generations. He formally declared himself Grand Master of the Jedi Order. That title had not been used since the days of the Old Republic, thousands of years earlier. Luke was not just leading the Jedi into battle. He was redefining what the Order was and what it stood for in the middle of a shooting war. The Dark Nest, meanwhile, was executing a strategy that went far beyond the front lines. Lomi Plo directed the colony to stage coups on the homeworlds of most of the Galactic Alliance's insectoid species. The logic was simple and effective. Insectoid races were more susceptible to the joining process than other species. Their biology made them easier to absorb into the hive mind. And if the Dark Nest could flip those worlds, the Alliance would lose allies and territory simultaneously. Most of the coups were stopped by Jedi teams who responded fast enough to shut them down. But the Killiks pulled off one that mattered enormously. They took control of Thyfera, the world that produced nearly all of the galaxy's Bacta supply. Bacta was the primary healing substance used across the galaxy. Hospitals, military medical bays, emergency response teams, all of them depended on it. Losing Thyfera meant the entire galaxy's ability to treat the wounded was compromised in a single move. The colony's army was growing through absorption. Insectoid races from across the galaxy were joining up, pulled in by pheromones and black membrosia and the gravitational force of a hive mind that promised belonging. Phepsis, Flacaxes, Geonosians, Yamri, Snootibs, Skurs, Verpines, Vratixes, species that had been part of galactic civilization for centuries were now fighting on the side of the colony. The Swarm War was not just a military conflict. It was an identity crisis on a galactic scale, with entire populations losing themselves to the collective. And while all of this was happening on the battlefield, Luke Skywalker was going through something deeply personal. He had gotten his hands on holographic recordings of his parents. He watched Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side. He watched Padme's final moments. For the first time, Luke was seeing the full scope of what had happened to the people who brought him into the world. And what he took from those recordings was not just grief, it was a lesson. He realized that the Jedi had become too entangled with galactic politics. The old Jedi Order had tied itself to the Republic, and that closeness had contributed to its destruction. Luke saw the same pattern forming with the new Jedi Order and the Galactic Alliance. The Jedi were too involved, too compromised, too wrapped up in the machinery of government to function the way they were supposed to. He called for a formal separation between the Jedi Order and the Galactic Alliance. The Jedi needed to be independent, answering to the Force and not to politicians. Luke was also wrestling with an uglier question. He and Jason had discussed the possibility of ending Raina Thul as a way to collapse the colony. Remove the leader, and the hive mind loses its center. The Killiks go back to being disorganized and scattered, the way they had been for 20,000 years before the crash on Yogoi. It was cold logic. And when 3 Jedi Knights found out about it, the reaction was immediate. Lo Baka, Tahiri Vela, and Tessar Sabatine were horrified. They argued that taking out a fellow Jedi, even one who had become something as alien as Unuthul, was a line the Order could not cross. Luke listened to their objections. Then he exiled all 3 of them to Dagobah, not as punishment, as a reset. He sent them to the swamp world where Yoda had once trained him, telling them to meditate and reaffirm their commitment to the Jedi Order before they returned. And then Luke uncovered something about Jason that shook him on a personal level. He discovered that Jason had tampered with the mind of young Ben Skywalker, Luke's own son. After a mission to Hypes, Jason had wiped Ben's memories. He told Luke he had done it to spare Ben from traumatic experiences. But the real reason was darker. Jason was hiding the fact that he had fathered a child with Queen Mother Tenel Kajo. The daughter, Alana, was a secret that Jason was willing to alter his cousin's mind to protect. Luke's nephew had reached into his son's head and erased memories to cover his own tracks. The trust between them cracked in a way that would never fully heal. The Jedi pushed into the Utagetu Nebula to strike at the Dark Nest directly. They found the Gorog hive ship and they hit it hard. The ship was destroyed, but Lomi Plo was not on it when it went down. She escaped, and before she disappeared, she left her mark on 2 of the people who came after her. She impaled Jason Solo with her lightsaber. She shot Mara Jade with a Gorog weapon. Both of them survived their injuries, but Lomi Plo was gone again, slipping back into the shadows the way she always did, untouchable as long as a single flicker of doubt existed in the mind of anyone trying to find her. The Swarm War was reaching its final stage. The colony was fighting on multiple fronts. The Chiss were closing in. The Alliance was blockading and striking. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the unseen queen was still pulling strings, still hiding, still pushing toward the only outcome she had ever wanted. Total expansion, total absorption, a galaxy where every mind belonged to the hive. There were 3 separate fights happening at the same time on Tenupe, and every single one of them had to go right, or the galaxy was going to lose something it could never get back. On the ground, the Chiss had invaded with thousands of troops. They came down in dropships and set up positions across the planet's surface, fully expecting to overwhelm the Killiks with superior discipline and firepower. What they did not expect was the tunnels. The Killiks dug beneath the Chiss landing zones and launched counterattacks from underground, hitting the invaders from below while they were still setting up their positions. The ground itself was working against the Chiss. Jaina Solo was commanding the Killik side of the ground war. Swarms of Juge and Rekka warrior Killiks moved under her direction, responding to her thoughts as fast as she could form them. Zek was running the air war, commanding squadrons of Keek and Ibea Killiks from the cockpit of a Stealth X starfighter. The 2 of them were still linked through their joiner connection, operating as a single mind split across 2 theaters of combat. Jaina could feel what Zek saw in the sky. Zek could feel the pressure Jaina faced on the surface. Their coordination was seamless and deeply wrong at the same time. 2 Jedi Knights, fully absorbed into an alien hive mind, waging war against the people who used to be their allies. The Chiss adapted. They pulled back behind shield generators and started launching insecticide into the Killik lines. Chemical warfare against an insect army. It slowed the advance and forced the Killiks into a defensive posture. The battle was grinding into a stalemate until something broke through the Chiss shields that nobody on either side had prepared for. A Kolossolok, one of the most massive Killik forms in existence, large enough to breach the shield perimeter through sheer size and force. The Kolossolok tore through the Chiss defensive line, and the battle dissolved into chaos on both sides. Neither army had a clean advantage anymore. It was just destruction spreading in every direction. And that is when the Chiss revealed what they had really brought to Tenupe. Hidden among their forces was a bioweapon, a parasite specifically designed to target Killik biology. If deployed, this parasite would spread across the entire planet and wipe out every Killik on the surface. Total extermination of the species on Tenupe. The Chiss were prepared to commit genocide to end the Killik threat permanently. They had decided that the only way to guarantee the colony would never threaten the ascendancy again was to erase them from this world entirely. Leia Organa. Solo found out about the plan from the inside. She had been captured and was being held aboard a Chiss capital ship in orbit. From that position, she learned the details of the bioweapon and understood what the Chiss were about to do. She reached out through the Force and warned Jaina and Zek on the surface. The colony's survival now depended on stopping those weapons before they could be activated. The air battle above Tenupe intensified. Jedi pilots scrambled to intercept the bioweapon delivery vessels before they could reach the planet. Leia herself got into the fight, and during the dogfight, she shot down Jagged Fel. Fel had been commanding Chiss Clawcraft against Jaina's forces, flying on the opposite side of a war from the woman he had once been close to. Leia put his ship down. He survived the crash, but was stranded on the planet's surface. 2 of the parasite bombs made it through. They landed on Tenupe. The weapons were on the ground, and if the Chiss activated them, the Killiks on the planet were finished. Leia and Jedi Master Saba Sabatine raced across the surface to find the bombs before it was too late. Leia found more than the bioweapon. She found Alema Ra. The former Jedi turned Knight Herald of the Dark Nest was waiting on the surface, and the two of them fought. Leia Organa Solo, who had spent most of her life as a politician and a diplomat, was now in a lightsaber duel against a fallen Jedi who served the Unseen Queen. And Leia won. She reached out through the Force and summoned one of Tenupe's native creatures, a massive spider sloth, and turned it against Alema. The creature attacked, and when it was over, Alema Ra appeared to be finished. The Knight Herald was down. Leia and Saba found both parasite bombs and detonated them beneath a river. Submerged in water, the parasite could not spread. It could not reach the Killiks. The bioweapon was neutralized. The genocide the Chiss had planned was stopped by two people who refused to let it happen, regardless of which side of the war the Killiks were on. High above the planet, a completely different confrontation was playing out. Luke Skywalker led a squadron of YVH bug cruncher droids to board the Star Destroyer Admiral Akbar, the same warship that Lomi Plo had stolen during the previous year's conflict. The ship was in Killik hands, and somewhere on board was Unu Thul. Luke found him. The Jedi Grand Master and the leader of the colony stood across from each other on the deck of a stolen Star Destroyer, while a war raged outside the viewports. They fought. Luke was the better combatant, and in the course of the duel, he severed Rayna Thul's arm. But Luke did not finish him. Instead, he did something harder than winning a fight. He talked to the person buried inside the hive mind. He reached past Unuthul and spoke to Rayna, the young man who had been taken on Banu Ras, the Padawan who had dragged two dark Jedi from a burning ship because he believed every life was worth saving. Luke convinced Rayna to come back, to let go of the colony, to revoke his control over the hive mind and return the Killiks to the disorganized, scattered civilization they had been for 20,000 years before the crash on Yogoi. Rayna listened. He let go, and with that single act, the colony began to collapse from the center outward. Then Lomi Plo appeared. The Unseen Queen stepped out of the shadows one final time. She was done hiding. This was the confrontation that everything had been building toward, and for the first time, Luke Skywalker was ready for her. Luke cut the Unseen Queen apart. Lomi Plo, the Night Sister from Dathomir, the secret agent of the One Sith, the creator of the Dark Nest, the being who had manipulated an entire species from the shadows for nearly a decade, was gone. The Galactic Alliance fleet arrived to enforce the peace. Grand Admiral Peleion brought the Super Star Destroyer Megador along with multiple Star Destroyers, an overwhelming show of force that left no room for further fighting. The Chiss agreed to stand down from their extermination plans. The colony was broken. The Unseen Queen was gone. The Swarm War was over. And in the aftermath, the Jedi Order recognized something that had been true for a long time, but had never been made official. Leia Organa Solo was declared a full Jedi Knight. The woman who had led a rebellion, governed a republic, negotiated a truce, stopped a genocide, and fought a fallen Jedi in single combat, had finally received the title she had earned 100 times over. The colony collapsed the way a building collapses when you pull out the supports. Lomi Plo was gone. Rayna Thul had revoked his control over the hive mind, And without those two force-sensitive anchors holding the structure together, the Killiks fell apart. Nests that had been operating in coordination across dozens of worlds reverted to their default state. Disorganized, scattered, independent. The colony, the nest of nests that had taken 8 years to build into a functioning civilization, dissolved in a matter of weeks. The Killiks went back to being exactly what they had been for 20,000 years before a burned Jedi Padawan crash-landed on Yogoi and changed everything. The galaxy made sure it would stay that way. The Killik worlds were seeded with the Fizz, the same corrosive nanotechnology that had been discovered on Woteba in the Utagetu Nebula. The Fizz would prevent the Killiks from over-consuming their planets the way they had consumed Oroboro tens of thousands of years before. If they stripped a world's ecosystem, the nanotech would activate and start dissolving whatever was doing the damage. It was a leash built into the ground itself, a containment measure designed to make sure the Killiks could never grow large enough or organized enough to threaten the galaxy again. Raynar Thule was taken into Galactic Alliance custody. The Jedi oversaw his psychological treatment, trying to untangle the mind of a man who had spent nearly a decade fused with an alien collective consciousness. It was not quick. It was not easy. 7 years of intensive therapy and numerous surgeries later, Raynar returned to the Jedi Order as an active Jedi Knight. He was scarred, physically and mentally, in ways that would never fully heal. But he was himself again, Raynar Thule, not Unu Thule, not the Prime Unu, a person. Not everyone from Tenupe stayed down. Alema Ra, the Night Herald, who had been attacked by a spider sloth during her duel with Leia, had survived. She was alive in the jungles of Tenupe, severely mutilated but still breathing, still connected to the dark side, still dangerous. Jagged Fell, who had been stranded on Tenupe for 2 years after Leia shot his claw craft out of the sky during the battle, discovered that Alema was out there. Eventually, Fell put together a task force with Jaina Solo and Zek to track her down. In 40 ABY, 4 years after the Swarm War ended, Fell found Alema and finished what Leia had started on the surface of Tenupe. The last remnant of the Dark Nest was gone. The people who survived the Swarm War carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Jaina Solo came out of the conflict permanently changed. Her time as a joiner had strained everything: her sense of self, her relationships, her connection to the people she loved. The bond with Jagged Fell had been damaged by the war, though the two of them would eventually find their way back to each other during the hunt for Alema Ra. But the deeper wound was the one between Jaina and her twin brother Jacen. The Swarm War had shown Jaina a side of Jacen she had not wanted to see. His willingness to manipulate, his comfort with dark methods, his readiness to cross lines that other Jedi would not cross. The distance between the Solo twins that started during the Killik conflict would only grow wider in the years that followed, and it would end in the worst way anyone could have predicted. Luke Skywalker took a different lesson from the Swarm War. His declaration as Grand Master was not just a title, it was a statement of purpose. The Jedi Order would no longer serve as an arm of the galactic government. Luke recalled all Jedi from non-order business and formalized the separation between the Jedi and the Galactic Alliance. The Order would answer to the Force. It would protect the galaxy, but it would not be a political tool. Not again. Not after what Luke had watched happen to the old Jedi Order in those holographic recordings of his parents. 8 years passed. The Second Galactic Civil War came and went. Jacen Solo fell and was stopped. Centerpoint Station, the world puller that the Killiks had built over 100,000 years earlier under the direction of the son and the daughter, was destroyed during that war in 40 ABY. And with Centerpoint gone, the black hole formation that made up the maw began to shift. The prison cracked. And Abeloth, the entity the Killiks had helped imprison at the very beginning of this story, started reaching out through the Force once again. By 44 ABY, Abeloth had escaped. The galaxy was facing a threat older than civilization itself, and nobody alive had any memory of how to stop her. Nobody except the Killiks. The Jedi sent Raynar Thule back. Along with Lo Baka and a Jedi healer named Tekli, Raynar traveled to the Tharut Hive's celestial palace to ask the oldest nest in existence the one question that mattered. How did the Celestials stop Abeloth? The Tharut Queen listened. And when Raynar told her that Abeloth had escaped from the maw, the Queen's response was immediate. She declared that the end of times had come. The entire Tharut nest shifted into a state of preparation for what they believed was the end of everything. The Tharut opened their memories. They revealed the full history of Abeloth's imprisonment, the cycle of escapes and re-imprisonments that had repeated for thousands of years. The son and the daughter returning to the Killiks, each time to combine their strength and push Abeloth back into her cage. And then the Tharut revealed the one detail that made the situation so desperate. The ones who had fought Abeloth throughout history, the son and the daughter, who had always come back to save the galaxy, had been gone for decades. They had perished on Mortis during the Clone Wars. The system that had protected the galaxy for over 100,000 years no longer existed. There was no one left to put Abeloth back. Getting access to those memories required something from Raynar that went beyond bravery. He had to rejoin the hive mind. He had to let himself be absorbed into the Killik collective consciousness again, becoming Thur Thule. After everything he had been through, after 7 years of therapy to reclaim his identity, after fighting his way back to being Raynar Thule, a person with his own thoughts and his own will, he had to give all of that up and walk back into the thing that had consumed him once before. It was his greatest fear, and he did it anyway. Everything that was Raynar Thule was submerged into the collective so that the Jedi could have the knowledge they needed to save the galaxy. That knowledge proved essential. The information the Tharut provided was directly connected to Luke Skywalker's eventual confrontation with Abeloth. The memories of a 100,000-year-old hive mind gave the Jedi what they needed to understand their enemy and figure out how to stop her. After the crisis ended, Luke sent Jedi Master Saba Sabatine to retrieve Raynar from the Killiks, partially to bring him home and partially because his presence among the Killiks would provoke the Chiss if it continued. And that is where the story of the Killiks arrives at its end. A species that started as the galaxy's oldest builders, assembling star systems and cosmic wonders under the direction of gods. A species that was exiled into darkness for consuming too much. A species that spent 20,000 years forgotten in the unknown regions until a crashed ship and a Jedi Padawan brought them back. A species that was manipulated by a hidden queen, dragged into a war, and then scattered again when the war was over. And when the galaxy faced the very entity that the Killiks had helped imprison at the dawn of history, it was the Killiks who held the answer. The oldest memories in the galaxy, carried inside a collective mind that stretched back over 100,000 years, provided the knowledge that saved everyone. The species that had been used, discarded, exiled, forgotten, and defeated still had one more thing to give, and they gave it.